Hello, this is Dr. Antoinette Linton, and I wanted to have a brief discussion about assessments today. I understand that some of the candidates will be diving into assessments this semester for their Cal TPA. If you are not one of my candidates listening to this uh, video, it's just a brief overview of the different kinds of assessments, how they're used, and how you can use them in order to improve your teacher practice and improve student learning. So let's hit it. Okay, so there's two groups in my mind about particular kinds of assessments and curricular properties that will be of asset to you when you're planning your assessment portfolio, if you will. You have traditional assessments, which includes quizzes and tests, and these can be paper and pencil, selected response, constructed responses. Uh, these things are worth being familiar with and important to know and do. Now, your performance tasks and projects are often complex, they're open-ended, they're authentic, work, career, entrepreneurial related. Uh, that's where we're trying to get kids um, in that world. We're trying to get them in a space where they're doing performance tasks and projects that are meaningful and valuable to them, that reflect needs of the community. Um, but we're not saying eliminate the traditional methods at all. We're just saying we should really start focusing more on performance tasks and projects. It's important that a teacher plan multiple forms of evidence from the assessments. Informal checks for understanding are a daily routine. Observations and dialogues with students, especially individual students in small groups, especially with the observations, you want to not only see if the student is performing tasks and using information to solve problems, but you also want to observe how well they're working with their peers, who can work with who has a lot of prior knowledge or funds of knowledge around the topic or concept that you're trying to teach, who needs extra help, who's introverted, who's extroverted, the status of the student in their peer groups. Those things are super important. And if you don't have really a hands-on grip on that information, kids can underperform in social groups that aren't conducive to everybody's learning. And then, of course, you have tests and quizzes, like an exit ticket, like a warm-up, or just a quick check-in quiz, if you will. Academic prompts and performance tasks. The difference between academic prompts are short, getting to know what kids understand, um, but they have something to do with a task in the future. So for us, it's like our anchoring phenomenon and driving question are academic prompts. The performance task is something akin to project-based learning, problem-based learning, investigation, designing a model. Those are performance tasks. Okay, so performance task is a complex challenge that mirrors the issues and problems faced by professionals in the subject domain. The context is real or simulated and involves the kind of constraints and practices of the profession. Students play a role in the task, and that role is developmentally appropriate for the student. So you can engage kindergartners in role-based performances of doctors and lawyers and accountants and nurses and fire people and um, judges and um, mechanics and physicists. Whatever you want them to engage in, it just has to be developmentally appropriate. Students are allowed to personalize the task. Can I draw this? Can I color this? I have an idea to do this. Students are allowed to personalize the task. Rubrics and performance standards are known in advance, right? So when you're introducing a project, you're also teaching the rubric as well. Academic prompts, open-ended questions or problems that require the students to think critically, not just recall knowledge, and to prepare a specific academic response, product, or performance. No single answer is correct and involves analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, some of the higher order Bloom's taxonomy spaces, and the depth of knowledge is deeper, right? Um, Moving on. Quizzes and test items. Everyone is pretty familiar with quizzes and tests. We all took them. Um, they're simple. They're usually recall, and it focuses on accessing factual information. Use selected response like multiple choice, true or false, and matching. Typically have a single or best answer, and they're super easy to score. And that's probably why we use it so much, especially if I have 200 students. Informal checks for understanding. Ongoing assessments used as part of an instructional process. Now you're checking to see if students are paying attention. You're checking to see if students understand the instructions. You're checking in to see if they can recall and make sense of what they've just read or just done. There are also ways for us to assess our own teaching. So if the students get it and they understand, that means that whatever sequence of activity or learning episode that you've planned went off without a hitch. But if they kind of get it or they don't get it, that tells you that you need to do something different. So in the state of California, we have our teacher performance expectations, and TPE 5 is about assessment. So here, you want to not only do academic prompts and performance assessments, but also informal checks for understanding meet the TPE 5 requirement. It's also for progress monitoring. Like I just said, you're going around, you're seeing if the kids understand the task. You see if students understand the product of the task that they're supposed to construct. You're observing, you are listening in on student discussion to see if they're using the academic vocabulary correctly, to see if they're clarifying things for each other, to see if they're working well with one another, examining student work as well, and think alouds. So the informal checks for understanding includes everything after TPE 5. Okay, so here's an overview of the different types of assessments that you can put into your portfolio as a teacher. You've got selected response, written responses, extended written responses, visual products, artwork, graphics, oral performances, discussions, debates, arguments, student demonstrations. Students come up in the front of the class as a group or whatnot, demonstrate what they've built, what they've created, a skit, a play, a robot, what have you. Long-term authentic assessments, this is what you unit plan around, a project that spans a couple of weeks. Portfolios, reflective journals, informal observation, formal observation. Student self-assessment, which is super important for those of you taking the CalTPA 2. They're really looking for students to be empowered with that level of agency so that they can self-assess, peer review, and others. Effective assessments require multiple sources of evidence. Try to have at least 3 sources of evidence for each lesson. And that could be informal checking for checking in progress. That can mean a test or a quiz. That could be a performance task. Evidence should be related to the following. Students are explaining things. Students are interpreting things. They're applying the knowledge that they are learning to a novel problem. They are expressing their points of view. They are expressing empathy for a character or each other for the teacher. They are expressing how they had a misconception and now that misconception has been corrected, or they're reflecting. So these are a number of different opportunities that you could have in a single learning episode. Um, moving on. Do your students get the opportunity to explain something? Okay, so explain sophisticated uh, and apt explanation and theories that provide knowledge and justified accounts of events, actions, and ideas. So teachers create learning experiences that elicit students asking these questions. Why is that so? What explains such events? What accounts for such actions? What do they know now that they didn't know before? What are their misconceptions that have been corrected? So it's very important that student voice gets planned in the lesson, um, and that they're applying knowledge that they didn't have before. Do your students get an opportunity to interpret? These are narratives, translations, metaphors, images, and artistry that provoke meaning. Teachers create learning experiences that elicit student questions such as, what does this mean? Why does it matter? Uh, what if? What does it illustrate or illuminate in human experience? So you can tie that into one of your reasonings for using a certain kind of assessment. Do your students get an opportunity to apply? The ability to use knowledge effectively in new situations and diverse contexts. Learning experiences elicit questions such as, how and where can we use this knowledge, skill, process? How should my thinking and actions be modified to meet the demands of this particular situation? Once again, this is about justifying why you're using the kinds of assessments that you're using. And notice that these are on the higher end of the Bloom's taxonomy level and the depths of knowledge. These are higher end portions. Do your students get an opportunity to perspective take? Super important here. And I think we need more of it because right now in popular culture, this is kind of lacking. We have an atrophied, um, almost a disability in being able to take different perspectives or take different perspectives into account. This is critical, insightful points of view, particularly from the point of view of the other, of someone else. Learning experiences elicit student responses such as, from whose point of view, from which vantage point, what is assumed or tacit that needs to be made explicit and considered? What is justified or warranted? Is there adequate evidence, right? Do your students get an opportunity to empathize? The ability to get inside another person's feeling and their world. Learning experiences elicit the following questions. How does it seem to you? What do they see that I don't? What do I need to experience if I am to understand? What was the author, artist, or performer feeling, seeing, and trying to make me feel and see? This is another super important skill set that we really should be teaching and having kids practice so that it becomes a habit of mind as adults. If we don't teach empathy and if we're not models of empathy, then our students are going to grow up to be adults who are either victims of someone not being empathetic to them or lacking empathy for anybody outside of their in group. Do your students get the opportunity to develop self-knowledge, the wisdom to know one's ignorance and how one's patterns of thought and action inform, as well as prejudice understanding? Learning experiences elicit the following questions. How does who I am shape my views? What are the limits of my understanding? What are my blind spots? What am I prone to misunderstand because of prejudice, habit of mind, or style? So, it's super important here. Students, I always say students should leave your teaching feeling more like themselves than before. And part of that experience is developing that self-knowledge. Not only self-knowledge, and I didn't think I could do this before, and now I know how to do this. I know how to do a quadratic formula. I know how to run a lab. I know how to write prose. I know about historical events, and now I can write a historical narrative. Those are all great, and that is part of the self-knowledge. But learning also how to be compassionate towards others, learning how to be respectful, um, learning that their culture, language, um, points of view matter and are important, and that they're important. So this is probably the deeper part of the philosophical and ontological perspectives as teachers that we have. Criteria and measurement. The need for criteria. Okay. So oftentimes students feel like if I can complete it, I'll get an A. If I turn it in complete, I'll give an A. And that is one criteria. Yeah, completion is one criteria. But we want to measure for understanding. We want to measure for value. We want to measure for meaningfulness. We want to measure for preparedness. Am I helping prepare this young person to become an adult in a community where not only they can solve problems, but they can solve problems that are valuable to the community as a whole, right? My grandparents used to say, don't go to school and be no educated fool, right? So we're trying to avoid that. So performance assessments, academic prompts, and informal assessments do not by nature have a single correct answer or solution. Evaluation is based on judgment guided by criteria. Okay, the importance of criteria. Criteria make things transparent, consistent, and fair. Performances have independent but related variables associated with them that can be measured. Criteria help define and operationalize those variables. That's why we use rubrics. This is why we use rubrics. Okay, rubrics and their functions. So a rubric is a criteria-based scoring guide consisting of a fixed measurement scale, 4, 6, whatever points you want, or whatever you deem appropriate, and descriptions of the characteristics for each score point, right? So here's an example. There's a criteria rubric here, self, peer, teacher. You get to assess yourself. A peer gives you feedback, and then the teacher does, right? Thoughts are well organized. Ideas are expressed clearly, written in uh, letter form, what have you. So the purpose of rubrics is to help instructors and students come to similar conclusions about the construction of higher level conceptual knowledge, performance skills, and attitudes. To make judgment-based decisions clear, consistent, and defensible to students and instructors, and then provides a description of the levels of performance, either holistic, analytic, and sometimes performance task. Okay, so rubrics are used to measure students' ability to use and apply factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive knowledge, define a fixed measurement scale, describe the characteristics for each of the scores on the fixed measurement scale. Types of rubrics. Okay, you have performance list, holistic rubrics, and analytic rubrics. Please know which one you're using, right? So analytic is each criterion is evaluated separately. Some of the advantages for this. Diagnostic information, you know where in the academic procedure the person needs more help. Gives formative feedback, links instruction to what the kids are knowing and what the kids are doing. It's adaptable, and and you have the ability to combine the scores. The disadvantage is more time to evaluate when scoring multiple items. So it's not like, oh, you've got it complete. You may have 5 different criterion, and each one of those criterion need to be scored. So you're looking at a student's work 5 different times, looking for 5 different criterion. If you got 150 students, this is hard to do, right? So you want to give yourself enough time to get that done. Holistics are all criterion are evaluated simultaneously. The advantage is you score it faster. It's good for summative assessments. The disadvantage is it does not communicate what needs to be improved because the criterion are evaluated simultaneously. They're not pulled apart, if you will. And it's not good for formative assessments. So it is what it is. Performance list. I like these a whole bunch because performance list allows you to look at the analytic portions as the students are creating or performing them as they go through a project. Great for self-assessments for the students. You get to reverse engineer each criterion, if you will, in the performance. And when the performance is complete and the product is built, then you can slide into the holistic part because now all the criterion have been checked, basically. Um, a performance list consists of a set of criterion elements or traits and a rating of a set criterion element or trait and a rating scale, right? So holistic rubrics provide an overall impression of a student's performance. So this is a sample. The work does not, this is one. Let's not even look at one. Let's look at 4 because we're not deficit. The work shows exceptional understanding of foreground, middle ground, background, atmospheric perspective, overlapping, and size variation. This sounds like an art rubric. So like the person said, all of the criterion are gathered at the same time. There is no separate there's no separate score for each of these 4 areas. You either have it all or you don't. This makes for a great summative evaluation tool. But formative, I can't tease out with this holistic rubric. I can't tease out the work shows exceptional understanding of foreground, middle ground, and background, but this person still needs to work on the atmospheric perspective. It's either all there or it's not. So it provides an overall impression of the student's performance. It measures performance expectation and problem solving skills. Quick to use and provide users with a snapshot of the performance at hand. Best used for summative assessments. The limit is the measure does not provide details and thus specific feedback of the performance cannot be given. Analytic rubrics. Now we're getting to the nitty gritty. You can do all kinds of stuff with analytic rubrics. Divides a product or performance into distinct traits or dimensions and judges each separately. So a kid can be great at one criteria and still need help. And using analytic rubrics, you can tease out what those criterion are. It's great for student self-assessment, used when engaged in a complex performance, a process of learning, or a skill when a product is being produced. The benefit, each trait can be scored separately, identifying specific strengths and challenges. Limits, it takes heck long to use this tool. So you want to plan points in the project where you're looking at particular criterion and you're grading them or you're giving feedback on them or the kids are getting feedback to each other that day or that week. You want to give yourself some time. The role of rubrics in instruction. The role of rubrics in instruction provide the criteria and levels of performance to assess student work that is not traditional. So performances, portfolios, papers, teamwork, rubrics should accompany all non-traditional assignments. Generic versus task-specific rubrics. Okay, so a generic rubric can be applied to different tasks within a single unit or a series of lessons. Serves as a reference for learners whenever they are engaged in learning. Specifically, if you want them to have an academic routine around something like a warm-up routine or a vocabulary routine or a creative ideas routine. Whatever the thing you want them to do often should have a generic rubric to it. And that way you never have to tell them what the expectation is after you've taught them the rubric and the task. Often covers modes of communication, ways of collaboration, and other general performances. So how to perform in a group, how to argue a point, how to have a debate. Those are the kinds of modes of communication. And you can also do nonverbal as well, nonverbal forms of communication. How to raise your hand, how to give, okay, I get it, I don't get it. Um, yeah. Task-specific rubrics include that they're usually used with particular practices, processes, and tasks, addresses specific forms of knowledge, skills, and understanding students will perform, have criteria and descriptors aligned with the discourse and skill norms of the subject matter. Oftentimes, we have kids talk and speak in ways that aren't aligned to how we deliver information in our subject matter. It is completely okay to have kids speak in their first language, speak informally. We encourage that, especially when they're uh, learning the task, learning the content, learning the performances, right? Learning the epistemic practices, if you will. They also need opportunities to write and talk and hear um, in the ways that I'm a science teacher, in the way the scientists do. How else are you going to critique it if they don't actually engage in it? They can critique that kind of language, and then they can learn how to make that language more accessible to populations that this information usually isn't accessible to. So I think having them engage in that language development not only probably strengthens their own general language development, but it allows them to become critical thinkers around it, right? Teach the rubric. I cannot express this enough. What I mean by teach the rubric, when you are introducing a new performance and a new rubric, you need to teach the kids how to use the rubric. What I normally did when I was doing this was that I would keep some student work from years prior, introduce the rubric to the students, and then have them use the rubric on the already graded work, and then have them talk about how aligned to the rubric the example student work was. Then I would have them tell me what the expectation was of the performance or the project. Students should have an opportunity to engage in this process. You introduce the rubric in the project. You have the kids have an opportunity to ask questions about the rubric, an opportunity to use the rubric and see examples of completed work. And then there should be a calibration between the peers and teachers about the rubric. So any clarifying questions that they may have, any improvements they may have to the rubric, this is the time for you to do that. Have students use the rubric in self-assessments and then also peer assessment. So using rubrics as self-assessment provides time for students to use the rubric in planned situations, encourages and reminds students to use the rubric before turning in the work. Peer assessment encourages students to use the rubric to discuss the project, to provide feedback to each other before turning in the work to the teacher. Um, Here are the roles of rubrics for evaluations. Um, Scoring rubrics. For giving students a grade or scoring, holistic and analytic rubrics are best. Remember that holistic rubrics are for summative work. Analytic rubrics are for formative and diagnostic feedback. Performance lists are always analytic in nature and can be diagnostic, formative, or summative. But note, because there are no descriptors to these levels, the meaning making of the performance list is only between the teacher and the students. Other teachers that use it may rate students' work differently. Creating a rubric for your lesson plan or for your unit, right? Use this guide to help you make decisions about which type of criterion-based tool you want to make. Do you want to make a generic tool, modes of communication and collaboration, how to collaborate, how to write or listen or speak? Are you doing a summative? Is this for a summative assessment? That would be holistic. If this is formative, it can be analytic, right? If this is task specific, content specific tasks related to norms of discourse and skill, you want to do analytic, and then you want to do maybe a performance list, right, for the students. All right, step one, choose an evaluation tool. Questions to guide your choice are, what is the purpose of the performance task? Is it diagnostic? Is it formative? Or is it summative? What is the evaluation tool? Are you going to do a performance list, a holistic, or an analytic rubric? Step two, range of scale. Oh my goodness. What is the range of scale? For a performance list, you can assign points that add up to a given amount. For holistic, yield a single score or rating for a product or performance like the one that we showed, 1, 2, 3, or 4. For analytic, variables of a performance are weighted and detailed, and they're usually given either a hard score or percentage. What criteria of understanding are assessed? So this is step three. 4 types of performance criteria are located here. You have content, process, quality, and the results, right? Content or conceptual understanding is one performance criteria. Then you've given them some process or activity to engage in. That's a second criteria. Then you have the quality, needs improvement, proficient, advanced, right? And then the results describes the overall impact and the extent to which the goals, purposes, and results are achieved. The content describes the degree of knowledge of factual information or understanding of concepts, principles, and processes the student achieved. How accurate, complete, correct, in-depth, logical, relevant, and sophisticated student performances or products are. The process describes the degree of skill of proficiency, also refers to the effectiveness of the process or methods used. So student performance is assessed based on how coherent, concise, coordinated, how well the process was followed, organized, planned, rehearsed, or skilled. Quality describes the degree of evidence in products and performances. Was the product creative, neat, organized, precise, stylish, well crafted? Results describes the overall impact and the extent to which goals, purposes, and results are achieved. Student performance was decisive, effective, engaging, informative, met the standards, persuasive, satisfactory, useful. Content and process. Each trait of the peer review performance list is an important dimension of the negotiation of expository text. This is the figure to your right. I use this when my students in my credential program are reading text and are reading each other's written product from reading the text in the course. So each trait of the peer review performance list is an important dimension of what negotiation of expository text is. Each trait has constraints or definitions. The scores add up to the total, and they're always refined based on student feedback, right? So as you can see in my peer review performance list, they have to check that they have 3 questions. Are there any methods for teachers? Are there any methods for students? What should be seen in a lesson plan? These are the questions I want my students to be thinking as they're reading educational information. Defining the traits of the criteria. So you describe what the trait is about or should contain. It says it's value neutral, but we all kind of know the things in your criteria are meaningful for the discipline or they're meaningful for you. But they may not be value neutral. So you want to make sure that you're not alienating kids by adding in something that's not valuable to them. So please check in with your children to see if the criterion makes sense to them. And if it doesn't, y'all need to have a discussion on what is valuable and then explain to them what the constraint is. The constraint is the discipline itself, right? And they're capable of engaging in the discipline, but you want them to be able to critique it, to add value to it that means something to them. And most of the time, it's not going to bother the kids, but you still need to check in. Define each rating. So ratings for each trait can be numerical, 3, 2, 1. They can be skill-based, delivery, developing proficient and mastery. They usually describe naive or sophisticated understandings. And if the top score point includes descriptors like consistently, thorough, always, etc., then write the parallel descriptions in the lower score points, sometimes and incomplete. Okay, creating a rubric for your lesson. So you've done all of this stuff, and now you're ready to do your lesson. So use this guide to help you make decisions about which type of criterion. So for me, I use the peer review rubric related to the net. It's performance list. I'm looking at a skill set concerning science education literacy. Who will use the evaluation tool? Students, of course. If students are the target audience, the tool should be written in an understandable way. But if teachers or parents or administrators are using it, you can still use the rubric that was targeted towards students because that's who we want them to learn. That's what we want to learn. So your task, you are a teacher candidate in a credential program. You have been tasked to create a rubric for an assignment that you have lesson planned for. Your job is to create a criterion-based evaluation tool, the assignment for the assignment and the lesson plan. You will follow the process presented in this PowerPoint to design your evaluation tool. Tell why you choose the type of evaluation tool, scoring rubrics and performance lists, what the tool is measuring, and whether or not it is generic or task specific and why. Thank you. And this concludes the assessment video.